What a weekend it's been in India. An education minister has resigned. The nascent Cockroach Janta Party is calling it a victory and has put its protests on hold. It's not a political party, but an online satirical campaign that in just a couple of months has become one of the country's most talked about youth movements.
I think after almost a decade, I finally have some hope left. Like it has rekindled that flame in us that we can still change the nation for the good. So yeah, it feels very inspiring and invigorating to be here once again and be amongst all these sea of people and still feel involved with all of them. That we came together for a greater cause. So that's very inspiring.
Not just Gen Z, but like millennials, boomers, everybody came forward. I think that courage was always there within. You just need somebody to stir it, and then, it comes out all at once. So, yeah, that's what happened, I feel.
So, how did we get here? I'm Genevieve Woo, and joining me from New Delhi is our correspondent Neha Poonia. Neha, you've been on the ground, and the resignation of India's education minister is obviously the headline. But what intrigues me is the speed of it all, right? Just a few weeks ago, most have not even heard of the Cockroach Janta Party. Today, it's claiming a major victory. Protesters took to being called cockroaches. It's not exactly flattering. But given the youth energy, they took it, they ran with it, they owned it, and they turned it into a symbol of survival and resilience. What did you see on the ground in your coverage? What was the tipping point?
Genevieve, no one saw this coming. If I were to just zoom out a little bit, take you to the beginning. So it was in May that you had India's top judge, Chief Justice of India, Surya Kant, who called some unemployed youth cockroaches and said they were like parasites attacking the system. This was in a regular court hearing, but Abhijit Dipke, the founder of the Cockroach Janta Party, he picked up on that and he posted on X. He said, "What if all the cockroaches came together?" Overnight, that one post blew up. He then sets up the Cockroach Janata Party. It's a viral online movement. People are generating AI images of cockroaches standing at podiums, cockroaches carrying out marches. It was this idea that, Gen Z was expressing their frustration at the system, but it was all online. I remember speaking to so many political experts who all said this is great. They were master following that's larger than Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP's following, which is quite a feat in India because he remains deeply popular. But it's still an online movement. It's not something we're seeing on the streets. Then you have this major medical exam paper leak. This impacted 2 million students. We saw a lot of anger. And that's an issue that Abhijit Dipke and the Cockroach Janta Party picked up. He returns to India. He was a Boston University graduate living in the United States. So he comes to the country. He starts holding these small protests, meetings in different cities. And he says, okay, I'm going to sit at Jantar Mantar, which is in the heart of New Delhi. It's a public protest site. Many demonstrations have been held there over the course of several decades. But this protest was seeing about 100, 200 people visiting it every other day from June to July. But in the last 1 week, Jen, is when things completely blew up. What truly changed how this movement was perceived and how this generation identified with it was a police crackdown that followed on Monday when some people tried to march to Parliament. That's when it snowballed so quickly because people were angry that the government was trying to stifle a protest. There was anger that this generation was feeling at being dismissed, at their demands not even being heard or engaged with by the government. And the government tried to, they've said the government tried to crush the movement, but true to their name, like cockroaches, they came back. And how? And that's when the protest in just 1 week, Jen, became what it is and wielded the kind of power that it was able to sort of show to this government that's not known to bow down to public pressure.
It's interesting, right? You say that, they tried to crush the movement, and it's like, how do you crush cockroaches? Which is what we use as well. And it has shown that it is near impossible, isn't it? So yes, you say it was peaceful protests leading up to this point, when the government decided to respond more forcefully. And that, like you said, was the tipping point. Yes, you're right. So Modi's administration is not known for changing course under public pressure. Yet the minister has resigned, and the protests have stopped. Let's listen to what the administration is saying.
फ्रेंड्स, विद्यार्थियों के भविष्य के लिए भारत सरकार
Friends,
लगातार
the government is taking several steps to safeguard the future of our students.
लोगों ने
Those who tried to ruin the future of the students are now behind bars. We've already established fast-track courts to deal with such cases. And tomorrow, July 27th, in the Parliament, we will be moving towards enacting stricter laws to reform the examination system.
कठोर कानून
But we have to think of the future. Our examination process should be reliable and trustworthy, transparent, and should be equipped with modern technology.
पद्धति विश्वस्त हो, हमारी परीक्षा पद्धति ट्रांसपेरेंट हो, हमारी परीक्षा पद्धति में सबसे ज्यादा अब टेक्नोलॉजी का उपयोग हो.
So that was Prime Minister Modi. What do you make of what he's saying?
It's interesting, Jen, it's not just what he said, but also if you look at how he said it. Mr. Modi is a master orator. It's his style of public speaking that endeared him to the masses in 2013 when he first ran for the post of the Prime Minister. He's won 3 back-to-back mandates, the last one being the first one where he didn't win an outright majority in. But he's someone who is known to be a good speaker. You can see that this time around, though, he's changed how he's engaging. He's posted a vertical video, something you'd see on digital platforms, something you could share widely across Instagram. And it's far more conversational because he's trying to reach out to a generation that responds to this medium. He's also, in the last 3 days, posted 3 such videos where he's reached out to the students. He's not directly addressed the protests at any point, but he has acknowledged that there was anger. He said he's going to bring in legislation. He's going to fast track how these exam leak papers are, prosecuted in courts. But all of this points to the fact that pressure was building on this strongman leader who has so far been invincible in a lot of ways to public pressure. And it wasn't just the fact that tens of thousands of people were protesting just a stone's throw away from where he sits in office every single day. It was also the fact that similar protests were breaking out across the country. The Cockroach Janta Party was saying, if the minister doesn't resign, let's all agitate in every district of India. The opposition was picking it up. You had Rahul Gandhi, India's main opposition leader. He held a impromptu protest outside Prime Minister Modi's residence last week. He was forcibly dragged away by the police. They've held protests inside Parliament. All of this was adding pressure because the worry was not only would this give political opposition more ammunition to target the government, but also it could lead to eroding Mr. Modi's hard-won political capital over the last 1 decade because the youth in India, Jen, are a very critical vote bank. Also because India is one of the youngest countries in the world, and many people who were agitating here will be voting in the next election, which is not happening immediately, but how you deal with youngsters could have an impact on your next, bid at running for office. And all of that, I think, clubbed together resulted in the government saying, okay, we need to ensure this is dealt with quickly because I don't think they anticipated that it would get so big in just 1 week's time. As far as the protesters are concerned, the Cockroach Janta Party, they've said they're suspending the movement in good faith. They've said our main demand has been met, that Dharmendra Pradhan is resigned, but we will wait to see whether the other demands are actually fulfilled. One is compensation for the 20 students who've lost their lives by suicide following their exam leak. And the third, the more critical demand was that no one who participated in this agitation anywhere should be prosecuted or see police cases filed against them. So they're saying the movement continues. They will meet with the government again in a month's time. So they've moved away from the protest side, but they've not dialed back the pressure.
It's interesting you said that, this movement was picking up momentum right in the heart of where Modi sits, right? It's in New Delhi. So from where he is, he can probably see how it's growing day by day. And that probably would have alarmed him, alarmed his administration. One political scientist, Dr. Ronojoy Sen from the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, he believes that the Modi government underestimated what it was dealing with. Let's have a listen.
I think there was an underestimation of the CJP's strength. And what happened today, the resignation of the minister, was really something that could have possibly been done earlier, that might have actually diffused the protests. So in a sense, I would say this was a classic case of the government not realizing the strength of the student-led movement. Despite, of course, one might add, we've seen a history of Gen Z-led protests in South Asia over the last few years, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and Nepal, actually resulting in large-scale changes in the politics of those countries. So that should have been at the back of the mind of the BJP government, but I think, again, they did not realize where this was eventually heading to.
Neha, do you think he's right? Did the government underestimate the movement or underestimate this generation?
I think they did. It's also because a lot of people have been speaking to say, politicians who are of a certain age group don't necessarily understand this generation. I mean, you and I, for example, we've been sitting in office and talking about how Gen Z is so different from, let's say, the millennials or the boomers. And that is true of how this generation organized itself and came together for this protest as well. I think one main thing was the government misread the public mood because of the fact that for 2 months, nothing major happened. It was only in the last 1 week that things really developed. The government first dismissed it as an illegitimate protest. It accused the Cockroach Janta Party of having backing from other opposition parties. It said it's not a legitimate protest that represents the voice of the people. The former Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan himself called it an anti-national movement. So there was every attempt made to discredit it, but none of that worked. And then you had the police crackdown. So they tried to, forcibly remove these protesters, thinking, okay, they've agitated, we're making changes, it's all going to go away. And that was, I think, the main miscalculation, the fact that they used force to get people to leave, and that backfired because they also miscalculated how much anger there was. The resolve, the brazenness of this generation, the fact that they stood up and faced off against riot police teams, police officers, and also the power of social media. They were mobilizing over social media through memes, through funny videos. They were completely defiant in the face of what was the government's attempt to dismiss this movement as being legitimate. And because of that, I think it took on a life of its own. It became larger than life. It became more than just the Cockroach Janta Party. It became more than just this exam leak scandal that started it off. And I think what this also presents is a lesson for the government, for any establishment, because one, how do you communicate with this generation that is not on traditional media platforms? How do you reach out to them? That's why you're saying, Mr. Modi, make these vertical Instagram videos. How do you engage with organic movements that spring up almost out of nowhere and then become this huge thing that have the power to force a resignation in a government that has, in 12 years, never done anything like this? And the fact that you weren't able to sway public opinion against this, you weren't able to convince people that this is not legitimate, that this is not worth engaging with. And that has shown a chink in Mr. Modi's strongman armor, because so far the idea was that he's invincible, he's immune to public pressure, he remains popular no matter what. But this protest, changed that perception that any politician who's voted to power is, at the end of the day, protesters were telling me, answerable to that very public that brought him to power.
Right. Now, speaking of the anger that you talked about, right? Let's take a step back and examine the origin of this, I suppose, this simmering anger. Clearly that was below the surface simmering, but it boiled over, it spilled out into the streets, right? It struck such a chord with young Indians. So what frustrations was the movement tapping into that traditional politics perhaps wasn't addressing?
That's an interesting question, because when you talk about this protest, simultaneously you had the Congress Party, which is India's oldest and main opposition party now. They were running a similar campaign where they were demanding accountability from the government. They were raising the issue of exam paper leaks. But because of what happened in the last 1 week with the police crackdown and with the government repeatedly dismissing these protesters who had come out, in such large numbers, it's unfathomable. There's no room to walk, Jen, when you went to Jantar Mantar. So I think it's representative of a bigger problem. It became about how the youth feels, and this is what many protesters told me when I was out there, that traditional politicians don't listen to youngsters. They don't view them as legitimate voices expressing frustrations with real issues that people are facing on the ground. It became about youth unemployment. It's staggeringly high for people under the age of 25. People there were saying, we pour millions of rupees into getting our education, but where are the jobs? Where are the well-paying jobs? The cost of living crisis, it's hard to make ends meet. And there were people from all walks of life there, people who leave their farmlands in rural India, come to urban centers like Delhi, hoping that will mean their lives will turn around. They end up living in urban slums. It was frustration at that. The fact that this is one of the youngest populations in the world, but there aren't enough opportunities for everyone. And also, of course, the fact that social media played such a crucial role. Millions of Indians we know are online. A lot of them are youngsters. The fact that they felt heard and seen in that social media bubble where they weren't getting that same response from the establishment. And that's where humor cut through a lot of this. So, you had so many funny memes, you had so many hilarious posters, and this generation is irreverent. That's what I think I took away from this protest side. They were raising serious issues, but they were okay to laugh about it. They were okay to say, we can be funny and still demand change. And I think that's a big departure from how protests have played out in the past. They've been very serious gatherings of people of a certain age group. These were youngsters who were, coming up with a new slogan every minute. They had posters written on the fly, some of them falling asleep with a phone on their foreheads with a funny poster on it. They were selling food with memes linked to Mr. Modi. So there was this very natural sort of mobilization and development of the protest. And then what happened is the numbers swelled. There was also cross-generational support. Parents started coming in to help their children, and a lot of people who saw what was happening on social media went out of curiosity to see what Jantar Mantar looked like. So I think all of that played a role in making it what it eventually became.
Right. And, given that's, the breadth and the depth, and the momentum, my question is, what happened to the opposition party? Why would they, did they not have their finger on the pulse? They didn't manage to channel this anger, did they?
Absolutely, Jen. I mean, I don't think it was just Mr. Modi and his party that didn't read the room accurately. It was also the opposition. These protesters were sitting in the heart of Delhi, as I said, and while some politicians had engaged with this group, they didn't get the kind of support they eventually get in the initial days. It was only when the police crackdown happened on Monday that Rahul Gandhi picked up the issue. That's when he held his protest outside the Prime Minister's residence. That's when we saw a huge number of politicians going to Jantar Mantar, expressing solidarity with the students. I think part of it was them acknowledging that, look, we didn't realize that this was such a major issue, but to also, it was reflective of the fact that this was a plank that they could use to target Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But you're right, it does reflect that across the board, all political parties don't have the kind of connect with young voters that they should have had. And likely this protest will change that. It also talks about this political vacuum, I think, because a lot of parties are raising these issues in their campaign speeches ahead of elections, but no one has been able to capture the imagination of an entire generation like this protest did. And the fact that this was completely unorganized in a lot of ways, it didn't have the backing of a political party, even though some supporters from Mr. Modi's party claim this was backed by minor opposition parties. The CJP has repeatedly said that's not the case. So it did become eventually civil society versus traditional politics. And that's where the Cockroach Janta Party rose in some ways to fill this space.
Right. Now, I think it would be accurate to say very few people expected, a satirical online campaign to end, right, with the cabinet minister resigning. I think perhaps not even the protesters themselves, not the government, and perhaps not even the movement's founder, right, Dipke himself. Now, political analyst Professor Sumit Ganguly believes that that's because the movement quickly became something much bigger than its creator. Let's have a listen.
I don't think that Dipke had anticipated the scope and the extent of the reaction it has generated, and it points to an underlying sense of deep discontent amongst a certain segment of India's youth who feel that no government in the recent past has really addressed their concerns about the inadequacy and the lack of employment in the country.
What do you make of our professor's assessment?
I think that's right. And I think the Cockroach Janta Party recognized this very quickly as well, because we saw this in the kind of messaging that came out. So we were at the protest site when there was that second meeting that happened between senior government ministers and representatives of the movement. And you had Abhishek Dipke pose questions to the crowd. He said, should we call off the protest if the minister doesn't resign? And there was a loud, resounding no. So he was trying to show that I started this movement, but it's no longer about me, because, as I said, young people recognized that there were frustrations that they were feeling that weren't being heard. And this became a platform to vent against a government that had been in power for 12 years. It came about expressing dissent. This is the largest show of dissent we've seen against Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his 12 years of being in power. There have been protests, bigger ones in the past, including the farmers' protest in 2021. But that was on the outskirts of New Delhi. You know, it didn't happen so close to the seat of power. It didn't happen so spontaneously. And that's what made this movement self-sustaining. And towards the end, I remember Abhijit Dipke, when he found out that the minister had resigned, he fell to his knees. There was a look of celebration and relief on his face. But then he turned to the crowd and he said, don't make me a hero for doing this. You guys did it. It was because you guys showed up in such big numbers.
Okay, maybe one last question for food for thought. Now, even if the Cockroach Janta Party fades from the headlines, I mean, the protests have largely suspended now, or even if Dipke steps away, right? Has this movement let the genie out of the bottle, right? Meaning, has it awakened a generation that now believes it can force political change? And how are politicians going to respond to that?
Absolutely. I think it changes the very script of political engagement in India, especially in the last decade or so, where a lot of people have spoken about this. There was this idea that because Mr. Modi was such a popular leader, he enjoyed popularity across so many cross sections of society. He was also a leader that was immune to criticism. You could not criticize him. You know, people did criticize his ministers, but never Mr. Modi directly. And that changed with this protest. That aura of invincibility, that aura of untouchability has in some sense disappeared. It also did away with this idea of fear that you couldn't talk against the government without facing repercussions. And like I said, Gen Z did it with irreverence, with this brazenness that other generations possibly have not even considered doing. And that reflects this new confidence that young people are feeling. A lot of people told me, this is a democracy. I have the right to be here. I have the right to question my government, from the prime minister to the education minister. I can ask questions and they are answerable to me. I am not answerable to the state. And that sort of flips this narrative that is played out for Mr. Modi's 2.5 terms in power. And it does set a precedent for future movements, because people, when they were leaving from there on Saturday, were telling me, we can do this again. If there's another issue that captures a nation's imagination, we will come out in equal numbers. We can agitate. We can force change. And I think this will also mean the government will respond differently. I don't think the script that played out this time, where they used force initially, where they dismissed the movement, would necessarily happen the next time such a large gathering happens overnight. And the opposition too, I think, will also have to be more alert, to be clued into what people on the ground are feeling, to raise this issue preemptively, so that they can truly help counter the government's narrative in Parliament, for example. And I think it also shows that for the young people, they had lost faith in the three pillars of a democracy, in the judiciary because of what the Chief Justice said, in the government because of how the protest was handled initially, and also the media because the mainstream media, to a large extent, were repeating what the government was saying initially, where they were dismissing the movement. So that's forced Gen Z to recapture space for themselves. And just as a final thought, a lot of people have compared this to what happened in Sri Lanka, Nepal, in Bangladesh. But the reason why this was different is because people hadn't lost faith in the idea of what a democracy guarantees them, that they have the right to protest, they have the right to protest peacefully, they have the right to demand answers and accountability. And I think that's what made this larger than life.
I mean, absolutely. It's like now they're all holding up their right to question, like you said, right? They have lost faith in the three pillars. We can challenge some of these assumptions that we've lived with, right? Neha, thanks for joining me, and thanks for all your work on the ground. I suppose one lesson from this story is, underestimate a cockroach at your own peril.
I agree. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Neha.
Thanks so much, Jen.
Political satire has always found ways to expose uncomfortable truths. Sometimes it's a cartoon, sometimes a comedian, and sometimes a cockroach. Now, cabinet ministers can be replaced. Expectations are much harder to reshuffle. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the CNA Correspondent podcast. It's brought to you by Tiffany Ang, Nathan Tavero, Craig Dale, Zikri Ayman, and me. Bye for now.